find such a love at our age. Whoever thought we could dance on a thrilling...
Welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'm your co-host, Judy Alexander, and I'm here with my husband, Dr. Bruce Chalmer.
Hello, Judy. Hello, viewers and listeners. Judy, tell folks the title of our exciting episode for today.
The Better Man, Polyamory and Consent, an interview with Dr. Eric FitzMedrud.
Yes, indeed. And Eric was really interesting.
He certainly was.
And
what a nice guy.
Nice guy and full of interesting information and experiences. And if you want to learn more about polyamory, and it was so interesting because he mentioned a person we had interviewed
Right.
a few weeks ago, or a couple months ago, I think by now. And so we seem to be, talking to numbers of people in the polyamory world.
Well, there's been a lot going on lately. The New York Times did a big article on it a couple of weeks ago in their magazine section, and it seems to be,
it's a thing.
It's a thing. Part of the zeitgeist now,
Yes, indeed.
Gaining
And of course,
traction.
what Eric had to say was about more than just that. He also was talking about consent skills, even which certainly accessible or relevant even to monogamous couples.
Right.
The notion that that getting consent can be sexy, which I thought was really kind of cool.
I like
too.
that. That idea.
That was a neat thing he was talking about. So do check out that interview. Before we do that, we have a few things to tell you about, just to tout some of our favorite things to tout. Judy, what should we tout first?
Let's see. How about if we tout the book that started it all, as I like to call it, Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back.
Indeed. That's the book that came out just in time for the pandemic 4 years ago. And that's really why we ended up doing a podcast.
That's how we started this podcast, because we couldn't go in person to promote it.
That's right. And we've been having fun doing the podcast ever since.
Yes, and thank you to all our loyal listeners who've been with us from the start.
And by the way, while we're on that subject, tell your friends, right? Let people know. Share us on social media and all that kind of stuff.
And thank you to the listeners who've come along since then, too. We don't want to diminish your contributions.
No, we are delighted.
We've gained a lot of new listeners over the years, so we're very pleased to have all of you. And like Bruce said, share us.
Absolutely.
Then we have the other book that came out this past year, right?
A little over a year ago.
Hey, it's not about communication. Why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong.
Yeah, that one is especially about if you want to get a sense of how do you make use of couples therapy, what's going on. I give people sort of a look under the hood, so to speak, the way I think about the process. And before we mention your book, which we will get to in just a second, I have a book that is going to be coming out very soon. I haven't got a date yet, but it is called Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. And it is, I'm very excited about that book.
Yeah.
I've been getting some really good feedback from folks who have read it, and I've got some folks who've endorsed it, and we're getting ready to launch that. And folks, you will hear about it here. And if you're on my mailing list, hint, hint, sign up for my mailing list. You can do that right from our site, ctn7.com, Couples Therapy in 7 Words, ctn7.com. You can sign up for Dr. Chalmers' mailing list. I will let you know, believe me, I will let you know when that is available. And I will be looking for folks, of course, to buy the book, because I think it's a big topic.
It is a big topic,
forgiveness.
and everybody in their life has either been betrayed or betrayed somebody,
or often both.
Right.
And it's if you're really reeling from it, it's a good book to be reading. Then that's what I wrote it for folks who are in pain from betrayal, and also folks helping people who are in pain from betrayal. So if you want to be, and there are people who are still trying to process betrayals from years before that's still causing them a lot of pain. And this sort of book, I think, will help you quite a lot. So then there is the book that your alter ego wrote.
That's right, Laria Zilber, The Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible, our sponsor.
Our sponsor, indeed. Yes, and I can vouch for Laria, who happens to be Judy. We're being quite open about that, as a wonderful writer of beautiful erotica. And if you like erotica, and this is biblical based, so that if you're into really engaging with the characters in the Bible, this gives a whole other dimension that usually is talked about those biblical characters. So do get a hold of that. You can go to lariazilber.com lariazyler.com, LARIAZYLBER.com. You can also go to Amazon and search for The Blue Tent Erotic Tales from the Bible.
Right.
Don't forget the erotic tales, or you will get blue tents. And you do not want to buy a blue tent, you want to buy the book. So, with that, let's go into our interview with Eric FitzMedrud, and we will see you on the other side.
Our guest today is Dr. Eric FitzMedrud. Dr. FitzMedrud is a therapist specializing in relationship and sexual issues in the San Francisco Bay Area. His specialty is helping men improve their sex lives by learning to regulate their emotions, removing sexual entitlement, and honing their sexual consent and negotiation skills. He is polyamorous and bisexual and lives with his wife of 23 years and his life partner of 6 years in San Francisco's East Bay Area. Dr. FitzMedrud's recent book is The Better Man, A Guide to Consent, Stronger Relationships, and Hotter Sex. Eric, welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we are delighted to have you, and Bruce, you usually start in, so why don't you take the
I'll
lead?
jump right in. We always like to ask our guests, for starters, how did you get into the work you do? Tell us something about your own journey into the work that you do.
Yeah, like a lot of therapists and other helping professionals, I had a lot of difficulty figuring out how to integrate my sexuality as a younger man. I grew up Catholic, and I also had a lot of desire. And I was really trying to figure out, it's very important to me to be kind and ethical. And it's really important to me to live those values even in the private sanctuaries of my life, not just out in the open. And at the same time, I had some difficulty figuring out what that integration looked like. I went through periods of time thinking that celibacy was the most appropriate path for a truly spiritual person. I used to think at different times that um, there were a number of other ideals that my sexuality ought to fit into in order to be good or good enough, or at least not bad. And a few years into my marriage, my first year in, well, really second year in grad school, first year in one of my programs, I had 2 affairs. One more emotional and relational that wasn't acted on as much physically, and a second one very shortly after that that was. Um, and I I had this split inside of me. I was both horrified by my behavior and at the same time so relieved to be expressing parts of myself that I hadn't found a way of integrating into my relationship, into my life. And after those 2 affairs, I read a lot. Really started studying a lot about sexuality and relationships. And one book in particular really helped me figure out how to navigate things, David Schnarch's Passionate Marriage.
Wow, I know the book. Yes, I've quoted from
And
it.
it really shifted my perspective from complaining about my partner to focusing on myself. I got into a men's group for the first time in my life. I realized, among other things, that almost all of my close friends up to that point in my life were women, which was and is still a beautiful part of my life, but that I was missing a balance of support and perspectives on what it was to be the kind of person that I was. And I went into a recommitment to my marriage. I went through a long multi-year process of healing from those affairs. And I also, what I now realize is I also went back into a process of locking my sexuality in a cage.
Wow.
Uh,
Mm.
and I really did a much better job for the next several years. I wasn't pressuring. I wasn't complaining about my wife's part in our sexual life. I really learned in a full body way how to knock my own socks off and create a deep level of satisfaction for myself. And 12 years after my second affair, I found myself in a third affair that surprised the heck out of me. It came out of nowhere. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't trying for it. Um, it was over the internet, and I deeply hurt that affair partner when I ended it abruptly when it was discovered and recommitted to my marriage. And I was also deeply searching during that process. Where are my ethics here? What's going on? How do I stop this? Why did this happen again? Despite all of my best efforts. And in that process of healing again in my relationship, my wife is an uncharacteristically, or she is an exceptionally forgiving and an exceptionally graceful person, I guess I should
Mhm.
say. And in that process, we began integrating the fact that I was polyamorous. I'd come out as polyamorous, even though we maintained our monogamy several years before.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that is the background of my perspective that I had learned to bring to working with men in my practice in psychotherapy. And a lot of the kind of personal research that led to me figuring out how to serve clients with some of the same needs more effectively. That's some of the background lenses that I brought to the Me Too movement as it was kicking up in late 2017. And I was writing a blog at that time for my practice. And I thought, gosh, there's something here for me to say. And it wasn't until early 2018, there was a particular story in the Me Too process that hit the headlines. And I was like, I don't work with sexual predators in my practice. I don't work with people who delight in violating consent. And I'm not a person who has that experience myself. But there is a thread that I see of consent violation and pressure that's um, something different. And in 2018, there was a story that hit the news that was closer to the experiences I do see in my practice. And that one catalyzed, okay, I can write a blog entry about this. And became two, and draft form became eight. And
Mm.
somewhere in there, I realized I was writing a book.
How do you discover that you're polyamorous?
For me, that discovery was one of looking at my life history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in uh, my first year of high school, I had this experience of serial monogamy. I was going out with girls and then breaking up with them rapidly. And it was because I was trying to be ethical, but I kept having feelings for more than one person at the same time.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Something similar happened in the first year of my college experience. Retroactively, I was like, I kind of should have expected that my first year in grad school, something might happen where have this opening to new connections.
Sure.
But it's also just this awareness that had been emerging. Like, I'm a person who can have um, feelings for more than one person at a time, and I'm a person who can communicate when I'm given the opportunity to in ethical, relational ways that maintain multiple sets of commitments at a time.
Mm. Yeah.
I can maintain attachments multiple at a time. I can retain an awareness of a partner's needs even when they're not there, and I'm participating in a relationship with another.
It's interesting, Eric, as you're saying that, because I think I've mentioned this before. I've been I've been in private practice coming up on 30 years.
Mhm.
And in that time, I've met all kinds of folks. And there, for a while there, it was striking me that it's almost like I was developing a subspecialty, that's kind of an exaggeration, not on purpose. But these
Mhm.
guys would come to me and they were clearly not jerks. Do you know what I mean? In other words, they were coming to me because they were distressed because they kept hurting women, not violently. They kept breaking women's hearts because and it seemed to me, it's funny. I wasn't thinking, oh, they're polyamorous. I'm not sure that term was nearly on my, wasn't on my brain, 25 years ago. But I kept thinking these are guys that if they were in some culture where they could have multiple wives, they would have multiple wives and be nice to all of them. They
Mhm.
genuinely cared about all these women, but they kept breaking their hearts because they would say, "Look, I'm not interested in a monogamous relationship." And the woman would say, "Well, I'm between things. It's okay." And of course, she wouldn't mean it. And and the guys would, there were like four or five guys who came to
Mhm.
me sort of one after another. It's like,
What's
gee,
going on?
what's going on? And it struck me that it was something analogous to sexual orientation. It's not the same thing because I am wired monogamous. Do you know
Mhm.
what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's interesting. You were saying you were able to maintain, ethical and multiple commitments. I don't know if I'm able or not, but I don't want to. And
Yeah.
and folks who are polyamorous, I think, want to. I think that's the difference. Do
Ye-
I get that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an ongoing debate in the polyamory community of whether it is more like an orientation, more like a capacity,
Hmm.
or how to best language it. Um, I know that for in my experience, I resonate with that development of the subspecialty. I was serving and seeing a lot of polyamorous clients in the process of me sitting there in the sessions and being like, oh, I might be one of these guys. I might be
Yeah.
one of these people. And was reading books and I eventually, expressed that to my wife. And again, right, her exceptional levels of grace and acceptance and kindness when I disclosed, and she knew that I was doing this exploration, that I was seeing clients like this, that I was doing reading about it. She was she introduced me to the first polyamorous person that I knew that wasn't a client.
Uh,
And I said to her, I think this is me. I think I'm polyamorous. And my memory of the story is that she looked at me, kind of cocked her head for a second, and she said, yeah, you are.
well, you describe her as incredibly graceful. And I often use
Yes.
that word grace. It's like, yeah, if you're handling this without panic, and and I'm sure you realize there's lots of couples where the other person might be very graceful but not accepting of it. And you think,
Absolutely.
well, I can respect you and even love you, but I'm not going to be married to you if you want to have sex with other people.
Yeah. And my polyamory is not a proselytizing form. I don't think that this is the higher, better way to do relationships. It's not what I'm trying to get people to do, but it was my path
Mhm.
to
So in
integrating my sexuality.
in our introduction, we introduced you as having a wife of 23 years and a life partner of 6 years. So how does that life partner fit in with your wife?
I mean, we live together in the same home.
Ah,
Uh,
Ah,
mm-hmm,
they don't relate to each other sexually or romantically,
mm-hmm,
but they, with some regularity, refer to each other as partners
mhm.
mm-hmm.
because we are all in this together. Um,
There's the metamor, right? Is
yes,
that
exactly.
the term that, yeah, metamors?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, we had somebody on a few weeks ago
yeah.
talking about polyamory. She also does therapy for people involved in polyamorous relationships, and she herself is polyamorous as well. So,
Might that have been Kathy Slaughter?
Yes,
yes,
it was. As a matter of fact. No, I'm
Friend,
trying to think, was that her name? Yes, that was her
yes,
name. How
a
about that?
professional colleague of mine through
I
our
get
Oh, how
that.
about
professional
that?
organization. Yeah,
There you go. Yeah, it is a small world, is it not?
it is.
Um, so I want to shift to consent because you wrote a book all about that, and in particular, you said what I wrote down. Oh yeah, you're saying getting consent can be sexy,
Mhm.
which is that's sexy, that's intriguing. Could you talk about that? And also, more generally, what do you want, especially men, to know about consent?
Yeah, well, let me start. Since writing the book, I've started talking about the difference between low bar consent and high bar consent. It's been become an easy way for me to talk about this term in the two different ways that we end up talking about it often. And so let me start with, hey, if you don't know how to make consent sexy, make it unsexy. It's much better.
Sign here. Right. Yes.
It's much better to start there and to practice this skill by making it awkward than to not be doing it openly, clearly, for your benefit and for your partner's benefit. And that's if you're a man or a person of any gender. And in that sense, at least we're looking to cross the low bar consent limit, which is the method by which we prevent sexual assault, rape, unintended consent violations, and deeply hurt feelings or feelings of violation. And there's a high bar consent. High bar consent is the process of communicating not just about what we aren't going to do to prevent negative feelings, but what we are going to do to create positive feelings so that we're creating and able to receive deep, powerful, and profound pleasure with our partners.
Mm,
And that consent goes beyond just the low bar to really orienting to what's possible here. What would really curl your toes? What would make you leave feeling like, ah, that was a healing experience for me? And when we orient to that process, the consent conversation can get really sexy. Would you like it if I did this? Oh, you wouldn't? How about if I did that?
yeah.
And now we can begin building some of, the pathways to pleasure and building an anticipation, building excitement along the way. And we even begin creating a script for ourselves in the middle where we can check in on the consent process. How's this going for you? Is
Hmm.
this as good as you thought? Did you said you might be interested in XYZ? How are you feeling about that now? And we can have those conversations in a warm and engaged way without losing some of the juicy heat that we've been building in the process.
That, it's interesting when I map that onto or juxtapose that with what I've heard from folks in the BDSM world, because I've always been fascinated by that distinction that it's profoundly all about consent. They are more explicit about consent than anybody else I've ever talked to, folks who are really active in BDSM type practices. And yet there is that element of fantasy where it's the opposite of consent. Do you know what I mean? In other words, part of what will often get enacted in fantasy is being taken without consent. And there are folks in the BDSM world who will make a point of not having a safe word, which scares the living daylights out of me
Wow.
to imagine that. But they will enter into it's sort of at the meta level, it's very consensual. They'll enter into activities where they will say, even if I say no, keep going,
Mm.
and they'll enact that without a safe word, which, as I say, to me sounds incredibly dangerous, but that's part of people's fantasies. I'm curious if you could comment on that, because that's sort of what do you do with that kind of
Yeah,
erotic orientation?
yeah, you're opening up a number of different
Yes.
layers of consent as it gets practiced in the kink community. So one of those is referred to as consensual non-consent. It's
Mhm.
the consent process that creates a scene, the term used in kink communities, but you can really think of it as an improvisational scene on a stage, right? We've
Mhm.
talked a little bit about what these parameters are going to be and what the parameters are not going to be. And we're now enacting a scene wherein, if someone looked at it from the outside, it might appear as if there is not consent at play here. The other thing is that when kink players are negotiating to not have a safe word, I mean, I think I'll be honest with you. I don't know that I have heard that. I've heard of kink players finding pathways to consent in scenes when words can't be spoken.
Ah,
Um, and so I think of that as a different process, right? If you can't speak, or if you want to be able to say no, stop, but you don't want to mean that,
Uh-huh.
then
mhm.
what are your other pathways to ending this process or to indicating that this needs to slow down and or halt entirely? And so, they'll create a situation of like, hold this spoon And during this process, you may not be able to speak, but if you let go of the spoon,
Mm,
then I
that's
will
yeah.
hear it fall and rattle, and that will
Hmm.
be my indication that something is amiss here.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, I guess one of the things coming back to that idea of what do I hope men learn about the consent process? The consent players are using all of that negotiation to protect everyone in the scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
The dominant person, the person with the active roles in the scene, also wants to come away feeling like they served or did right by the sub in the kink
Yeah.
scene. And so these lessons from kink community, from non-monogamous community, are things that can be of service even in monogamous and the vanilla couples who aren't practicing kinky sex.
Hmm.
And we are all served by a broadened consent repertoire, broadened consent scripts, not just, again, because they prevent us from causing harm,
Yeah.
but because they can create our pathways to deeper pleasure and intimacy with each other.
Well, I certainly noted as you were describing the sort of sexy kind of consent conversations, there's a big overlap there with seduction. You know, it's like it's inviting someone to get excited. If and of course reading to see that they are, and if they're not, then you don't do that. But if you know, it is sort of an invitation to up the excitement level.
It can be. And again, that's a process that you develop with an individual partner over time, right?
Mhm.
I was modeling a little bit for the audience what those sexy consent conversations might sound like.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Right.
wouldn't recommend that somebody use that model with a new partner.
Hmm.
I would recommend that you start in a much more sober and clear way. You don't want your new partner negotiating with you from an altered state. You want them negotiating with you from a clear mind and a sober state so that you can trust their yeses and their nos as you move into the altered state of desire and pleasure.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting in thinking of that state of desire and pleasure like a trance. It's a trance. I'm trained in hypnosis, you know,
Yeah.
and that's you're describing a trance state. And indeed, where's the line of, is one capable of consenting if one is in a trance? You know, as we all in hypnosis, we would note, the saying that hypnotists will talk about is all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. So in
Mhm.
a sense, if you're letting something happen, you're consenting to it. But I would imagine it's a pretty thin line in some cases.
Well, I think if we're going to use that kind of trance language or altered state language, a big part of what leaves a person feeling as if their consent was honored or not is whether the altered states that they find themselves in are the ones that they wanted to be in.
Yeah, yeah. If it feels good, right? If it doesn't feel good, don't do it. Yes. Yeah.
At what point do I don't know necessarily you, but clients that you see, um, like how do you draw the line where to go with the polyamorous and how many people are involved in any given relationship? And how do you have the bandwidth? I barely have enough for one.
There's something Kathy Slaughter pointed out was it's I don't know you must have heard this. Presumably, she was saying people in the polyamory community will talk about how they could possibly function without Google Calendar. You know.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's an individual decision. When you go beyond the monogamous framework in whatever way, right? Polyamory is just one form
Mhm.
of consensual non-monogamy. Each person ends up defining their own preferred parameters. I'll often talk with my clients about like, what is your preferred baseline location? And then around that, what is your window of tolerance that feels authentic and that you have the capacity for? And so, different people, even within the same polyamorous network, sometimes called a polycule, will determine those limits for themselves. Y- you know, and that might be different from somebody else within the same polycule. For me, when I was initially opening up with my wife, we had a lot of conversations about this because it was one of the concerns, right? Is this going to be like one other partner, or is this going to be like eight other partners and you're not going to have any time for me?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess to the listeners, I guess I want to open up two different frameworks. The first is that this question often comes up as an attachment protecting question,
Mm,
right? How many more partners are there going to be?
Mm-hmm.
Often is really a question of, are you going to keep our relationship strong? And are
Exactly.
my relationship needs still going to be met in this process? Um, and and then the next question is one more for the polyamorous person, and that's the one that you raised already, which is what kind of capacity do you have? And that really tends to depend on what kinds of relationships the person already has on board. I knew for myself that what I was looking for was a second life partner, and that I probably wouldn't be very interested in casual sexual relationships or one-off hookups. I just knew that that wasn't how I worked. It's not how I engage with any ease in sexual relationships. Um, Fortunately for me and my wife, I knew myself well enough that that prediction of what I was looking for seemed pretty, it turned out to be pretty accurate.
Mm-hmm.
mm,
So I have my two partners. Um, I still have a capacity to connect with other people, but I don't have any capacity for any more life partners. Just as you said, how could you do that? Like, how could you even have the capacity for more? That's how I feel now about having another partner, somebody
mhm.
that's a regular, consistent emotional, process of emotional labor and attention, connection. I'm at my limit.
Your other partners have other partners, if I could ask that?
They don't at this time. They
Mm-hmm.
could.
Mm-hmm.
At times, both of them have considered that. And their baseline is closer to monogamy. Um, and we'll see. Life's long.
Mm. Yes, one never knows.
Yeah.
You have a section in your book, and I have to
Mm.
tell you, we haven't had a chance to read your book, unfortunately. We often like to be able to, and we didn't. I didn't ask you for it. I should have asked you for it.
No
Uh,
worries.
but in any case, I had occasion because I knew I was going to be, we were going to be interviewing you this week. I was talking with a couple this week, and I mentioned the section you have in your book, which I said I hadn't read, but I saw this intriguing section, and we're going to ask this guy about it on Friday.
Yeah.
Um, be a better asshole. I just
Yeah.
love that concept, and I'm curious if you could expand on it. I have any, I wonder if what I was saying to the couple I was working with is any close to what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's one of the most frequently asked about sections of the book, and it's one of the most polarizing. So I really appreciate the
Oh,
opportunity to talk about it.
yeah.
So the fear when I say that is that I'm advocating for people to cheat or that everybody should be polyamorous, and that fear also always comes from people who haven't read the book.
Mm,
So what I am saying in there is that sometimes, and my audience for my book is men, sometimes men find themselves in a situation where they have gone past their own ethical limits, where they're doing something that um, isn't what they want to be doing or that they recognize is not appropriate. And I'm very clear in the book, I am not advocating for that process in any way. But for the reader who finds themselves in that situation already, you now have the opportunity. You're already an asshole.
mm.
Now you can be a better asshole.
Uh-huh.
So, and just I'll use my own experience, right? When my wife discovered my third affair very shortly into it, um, because I'm a terrible liar. Um, uh,
Which I tend to think speaks well of someone if they're a terrible liar, So,
I mean, it's a good quality to have.
well, it means you have a conscience, that's
Yeah,
which is,
Right.
yeah.
yeah.
So she checked me out. She's, what's going on? Right? I could have gaslit her. I could have tried to come up with a story. I could have tried to cover that experience or explain it away. And by not doing that, even though I was already an asshole for cheating on her, I was a better asshole.
Hmm.
To admit fault and to stop it or mitigate it in whatever way you are capable of is better than not doing that.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
do that.
That, yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, that's it.
Well, I was going to note, there's a sense there of accepting the reality as it is. One of the things I write about a lot, when I bandy about the word faith a lot, and I'm not talking about religious faith per se, though it's not inconsistent with religious faith necessarily, although it is inconsistent with fundamentalism, oddly enough. But it's not inconsistent with the sense that, whatever God means, God is good, or leaving out the concept of God, reality is right to be what it is. And what I noted early in my practice, what I noted is the folks who seem to be able to handle situations like you just described are the ones who could look at that, and both you and your wife sounds like needed to look at that and say, okay, there's something real going on here. Yes, I'm an asshole, but I'm also not crazy and I'm not fundamentally evil. So there must be something important happening. And the
Yeah,
people who can actually look at that are the ones who are going to do okay in whatever they'll, together or separate or whatever, but they'll be able to actually look at reality, work with it, rather than trying to deny it or just cover it up or whatever.
absolutely. And again, I'll just speak from my own experience. It's not like I was unconscious in the couple of weeks that that third affair was taking place.
Mhm.
I was sitting there and looking at my behavior, going, why am I doing this? Where are my ethics? I should stop this. And I couldn't stop it.
Mhm. Yeah.
I because I was in that process connecting to a part of myself that had been getting cut off by me, not blaming anybody else,
Mhm.
because I hadn't found a way of integrating it in my life. I couldn't stop it. It was so relieving to be experiencing this part of myself that I didn't know what else to do. And
Mhm.
so that's very common among people who are cheating is that they have not acknowledged or integrated something. And they are, because they don't know how to do it in their relationship, they end up doing it out of their relationship.
Mhm.
And I don't think that that's good or right. I would love to change our conversations so that we can do exactly that, accept more of the realities of ourselves. And in my book, that's what I'm trying to teach men how to do. Not about sexuality, not about polyamory, but about your whole self, your whole emotional self. There are a lot of men who, with their affair partners, reveal more of their emotional vulnerability because they don't know how to do that with their life partners. When we cut off whatever part of ourselves is vital and a part of our central being, it will try to find a way past those limits to reintegrate itself into our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can be better by integrating that more consciously and proactively ahead of time. And my hope is that I could save readers of my book some of the pain and save their partners some of the pain that I've caused in my life by learning from those lessons and being more proactive ahead of time.
Yeah. My favorite metaphor about what you're describing is, I talk about stability and intimacy, and intimacy is that sense of needing to actually be alive in the ways that you actually are, being honest with yourself and others. And when that gets compromised, my favorite metaphor is like a seed that gets planted under a sidewalk, and
Mhm.
it'll try and crack the sidewalk. And
Yeah.
affairs are often cracking the sidewalk, or sort of compartmentalizing or whatever. Something's going to happen that will upset that because it isn't acceptable. It's, the system won't accept it.
Well, and I think there's a fundamental truth about relationships that we haven't accepted as a culture that is true in monogamous relationships and friendships and family relationships as well. And that is just that when we are real and full and intimate with one another, we will end up hurting each other. It is
Yes.
Yeah.
inevitable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that we have these romantic myths about love and relationships that if I really love you and if you really love me, then we won't ever hurt each other.
Mhm.
And I think we need to accept that life includes these moments of suffering, these moments where we expect something that is different from the reality that occurs. And that by learning, just as you've talked about, to face and accept what is, and to grieve the loss of our expectation, we can come into relationship despite that and maintain that relationship in
Mhm.
some cases. And in other cases, simply and gracefully let go of that relationship with more kindness.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Good point.
it's that's the notion of faith. It's accepting. It's a mindset that says, okay, we actually have to work with this, and we can do it again with grace and love and compassion. And yeah, I've often noted, the chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety. Of course, David Schnarch had a lot to say about that. May he rest in peace. He died way too young,
He did. He did.
especially because I'm about the age he was when he died.
Uh-oh.
So yeah, indeed. What else should we be asking you about?
So, one of the things that I really like to talk about when I'm mentioning the consent process is that so often when people are asking about consent or advocating for consent, they really go to the script. How do you ask for it? How do you get it?
Mm.
And a big part of what I'm trying to teach is that before we get to even thinking about consent, before we even talking about bringing our desire to another partner, we need to start internally with our ability to regulate our own emotions. When we have the ability to regulate our emotions and we bring that to the process of consent, then we're capable of experiencing and really witnessing our partner's no
Mm.
Mhm.
and our own reaction to that.
Hmm.
Whether that is, oh, no, oh, that was really what I was looking forward to here. Like that's, we can sit with the disappointment of it.
Hmm.
We can honor our own desire and decide for ourselves, like, gosh, does that mean that I should say no? If you're not willing to do this, and that's what I was most excited about, would it be better for me to just bow out of this and say, oh, okay, thank you for letting me know. And that's what I was looking forward to. It sounds like we're not compatible in this moment.
Hmm.
W- But the underlying emotional self-regulation is the key, right?
Yeah.
We could teach 15 right ways to ask for consent, but if we don't have the capacity to regulate our own desire first, to really stay attuned with the other person, then it doesn't matter what words we were taught to ask for consent. We will be at risk of not listening to it, pushing past our own desire, um, and not really honoring what's happening in the flow of the process. For example, when there was a yes, and then the person says, actually, I don't think I'm
Hmm.
enjoying that. Please stop now.
Uh-huh.
I've often pointed out that those moments, which are absolutely inevitable if you're relating to someone long enough,
Mm.
there will be the moment, a simple moment when somebody is saying, how about whatever? And the other person saying, nah, not going to happen. And how a couple handles that moment, I'm thinking in terms of couples more than thruples or polycules or whatever, but how they handle that moment is like I mean, sure, I'm exaggerating by calling it a litmus test, but it's like a litmus test for how they're doing in general in the intimacy department. Because if
Yeah.
they can handle that with grace, as you described it, they're going to be fine. And it's interesting because the person saying no, if they're able to do it with compassion, if they're able to put out, well, it's not going to happen now, but hey, next time's going to be epic, or whatever,
Yeah.
and the person receiving the no receiving it with grace, all is well. And of course, the flip side of that I see a lot. I just had a couple of different couples over the last several months, one of which is still dealing with what happened on their wedding night, and they've been married for 15 years.
Mhm.
And what happened on the wedding night is she was too tired and said no, and he was really pissed and was a jerk. He's an asshole about it.
So he's hasn't become a better
He
asshole
has
yet.
not become a better. Well, he's working on it. That's why they're in therapy now. And then the other one, it's sort of interesting. They were seeing me about something else, but they sort of mentioned in passing with smiles on their faces, yeah, the wedding night. Oh my God, she was totally wiped out. And he said, I'm not a jerk. Of course it was fine. They
Yeah.
just took it for granted that that's fine. And they're just fine in the sexual department. It's
Yeah.
like, that's not their issue. They got other stuff, but that's not their problem. And it is really all about, as you're describing, that sense of being able to handle it with grace. And it isn't about the script. It's not about what words you say. It's about what's going on underneath that.
Right. So, a lot of the challenge too that men experience in relationship and sexuality has to do with another one of the fundamental pieces that I try to teach, which is that we often come to our intimate relationships desperate for human connection because we don't have enough human connection in other domains of our lives. Um, you know, I lean a little bit on Bell Hooks, who talks about how the first demand that patriarchy makes of men is not that they hurt other people, but that they cut themselves off from their own emotions.
Huh.
It's a paraphrase. I can never get the exact quote right. But we're left with this disconnect inside of us about our own vulnerability, about our own need to be held, to be witnessed, to be seen, to be, it often gets truncated into be respected as a man. But I do think that's a part of it, and I think it's important. But I think ultimately what we're looking for is we want to be of service. We want to be serving our communities. We want to feel like we have a place and a purpose. And we need to go back to that deep wound in us that the models of two-dimensional masculinity, whether we call it, the man box like Paul Kibble, or two-dimensional masculinity, or hyper-masculinity, or something like that, the narrow idea of what it means to be a man and how men show up in the world ends up hurting us and disconnecting us from important aspects of our whole humanity. And when we cut ourselves off from that and we try to narrow all of our capacity to connect either through anger or sex, we don't navigate either of those emotional experiences with skill. So we need to reclaim a significant portion of our own humanity, and that leads us to doing our emotional work. It leads us to enhancing our other connections, maybe doing men's work, maybe participating in a community, maybe just deepening our friendships beyond social activities into what's really going on for you. We should be able to answer, how is my best guy friend's family doing?
Yeah.
How is he doing? Is he satisfied in his relationship and his work? How is he feeling as a parent? And we should be disclosing enough about what's going on in our lives so that our closest friends know those things about us too. When we have that human connection, we don't come as desperate for sex.
Yeah. Well, men are not conditioned that way, They've got to be the strong, silent type. At least that's basically how we've been raising boys in our society.
It is. And then we get into relationships with our partners,
Yeah.
and they're desperate. Where are you? What's going on for you? What are
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
thinking? What are
Yeah.
you feeling?
They're not
They're
showing up emotionally.
right. And then we get into that relationship and we feel criticized and judged and deficient because we weren't socialized to have the
Right.
skills required to be in human connection and to maintain it. And
Right.
I'm really advocating for men to attend to that. You have all of the capacities. It is not a matter of men not being emotional, not being able to talk.
Mhm.
It is a process that we can learn, and we often have to go through these layers of attending to our own trauma in our socialization as men before we regain the capacity to first even be aware of our feelings, then to talk about the feelings, then to learn how those feelings indicate to us what our emotional and relational needs are, and whether they are or aren't being met, or whether we anticipate that they will or won't be met in this situation.
Mm.
Then we begin to dialogue about those, and our partners don't have to read our minds anymore.
Mhm. It's interesting. What usually gets got, well, I should say usually. I used to be a statistician way back in the day. From a statistical point of view, I know I have a biased sample, not a random sample of people that see me. No one ever makes an appointment with me just to tell me how well everything is going. But what seems to me like what gets us as men into that, nothing like a marital crisis to pull, or a relationship crisis to have that happen. Some
Yeah.
woman saying, I'm out of here unless this changes. And boy, does that get the guy's attention.
I've been talking with a lot of other people doing men's work, and I've been asking a question about that because I've had the same experience that a lot of men are brought to emotional relational work, doing men's work as one avenue of that by, a threat in their relationship, or by, a divorce or a breakup that really brings them to their knees. And I've been asking other people who do men's work, is there any other way that we can invite men to this work without it needing to come at the sharp edge of a threat? And I've been learning by talking with them. And some of the core lessons that I've been learning is we need to invite men. Couldn't you be in less pain? Couldn't you be less tired? Because it takes so much energy to hold all of that in
Mm.
and to divide yourself. And that we need to share how much more vital and energetic and alive it feels to be a person who really has integrated more of yourself. I don't think that it's an accident that my capacity to write a book came after opening up as polyamorous
Mhm.
Yeah.
and being able to accept those parts of myself. When I integrated that, my ability to serve the world increased. It became that my work in the world was much more energizing for me instead of exhausting.
Mm.
There is a vitality on the other side of this experience for you,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah. For people to see that certainly is an invitation.
Yeah.
And of course, they have to balance that against the sheer terror of going there,
Y-
which is
y-
why I think a lot of men don't go there
Yeah.
Yeah.
unless they get into a crisis.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's one of the interesting paradoxes to me of the notion of kind of what masculinity is or what manhood is. There is this fear that holds men back
Mhm.
from doing this emotional work. And yet, one of the narratives about what men are and what men do is that we face our fears.
Oh yeah, and we will not admit to ourselves that we're terrorized when we are. We will often, it'll be something else, but it couldn't possibly be that, oh my God, I'm afraid of this. This is really scary.
Yeah.
We don't tend to go there.
I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday. She's a retired therapist, and she was saying that these women used it was she wasn't a couples therapist. She was just a one-on-one therapist, and these men would come in with a list from their wives saying, "This is what my wife wants me to work on." And they're usually these IT type guys, and very not in touch with the emotional side.
Mhm.
I definitely see that. My practice is centered in Silicon Valley, so I see a lot of the
Uh-huh.
IT type guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
But I also, the Silicon Valley area is also a very sexually open
Mhm.
community and culture. I also work with a lot of gay men,
Mhm.
and I see these processes playing out with gay men too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I don't think that this is only an experience that afflicts heterosexual men or only afflicts cisgender men, or only men in heterosexual relationships. It's a part of the broad socialization of men that we can work against. And I think it's so beautiful when we do. We have this capacity, and suddenly our gifts, our real deep gifts, get unburdened, and we get to free them and offer them to the world. when we really connect to our whole self.
Well, Eric, tell folks how they can get in touch with you and get a hold of your book and, give that information.
So, my book is The Better Man, A Guide to Consent, Stronger Relationships, and Hotter Sex. It's available on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble. You can find out more about me or my book on my website, drericfitz.com, DRERICFITZ.com. And I'm on social media at Dr. Eric Fitz.
Great. And we will put that stuff in the notes for this episode. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yes,
Thank you
thank
for having me.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed that interview with Eric as much as we enjoyed interviewing him. And
Absolutely.
I hope you learned a lot too.
Yes, he had a lot of a lot of great stuff to say.
Mm-hmm.
If you would like to be a guest on our program, let us know. That is how we often find people, is they let us know that they think they've got some good stuff to say. Often it's folks who've written a book, of course. They want to promote their books,
Sure.
and often really interesting people. And or if you have some life experiences that you would like to tell us about, or if you have some particular issues you'd like to see us and hear us talk about, even if you don't want to be on the show yourself, let us know.
Right. Go to CTN7, our website,
.com.
CTN7.com, CT for couples therapy, and the numeral 7, don't write out the number, don't spell it.
Right.
I don't know why I'm having so much trouble talking today.
I don't
It's
think
Friday
you are.
and it's early. What can I tell you?
Anyway, yes, do that and
Yes.
let us know. Send us a message, and of course, tell folks about. But first of all, on whatever platform you get this, if you're getting this on a podcast platform, you're just hearing the audio. Make sure to like us and rate us and subscribe. In whatever the particular platform you're using, follow, right? And just tell your friends.
Yeah, tell your
about
friends.
us.
Share it.
Absolutely. And check out our books. I already mentioned in the intro, I've got a book coming out soon, Betrayal and Forgiveness. So watch for that.
Yeah.
Check for my other books. Check for Judy's book, The Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible. And I think we're all set.
I think so.
And until next time,
Remember, be kind
don't panic.
and have faith.